أولا سعيدة جدا بالمشاركة في
review. I'm extremely happy to participate with you in this panel. This is an extremely rich panel. We have different speakers from different countries. We will be tackling very important questions and topics that are right on point. I will give the floor directly to Dr. Naser Abdelkarim, who is an expert in the economic situation from Palestine. He was in charge of developing the private sector plan, and he has helped in drafting the Gaza's economic plan. He is currently a visiting lecturer in Al-Quds University in Palestine. Dr. Naser will be talking about the support in the region, how the support is, to which extent is it useful, if we could say so, is it really promoting social justice, and what is the impact of these policies on sustainable development? Thank you, Salma. Thank you for your moderation of this panel. I'm extremely happy to be with you. I would like to ask Behter, please, to share my presentation, to share the screen. I will be talking about support or subsidies related to different products. So this is based on a report that I'm currently drafting about the topic, about the subsidized products in the region. I would like as well to benefit from all your comments and your observations to enrich, if you could say so, my report. Again, the aim is to have a map of different subsidized products, how subsidies are being allocated, the path throughout the past years, and whether these subsidies will still be on, the relationship between the subsidies and the reforms, financial reforms. This report is rather analytical, so I'm analyzing in the report different data published by some formal or public and private institutions. We had distributed as well a poll through ANND to different target countries. The aim was to get to know how the situation is in different countries across the region. So it was an attempt, if you could say so, to get to know more about the experiences of people of the region. The methodology is related to the data published. So slide 4, regarding the different the different topics of the report, we will be talking about the different countries in which subsidies are implemented. We will be talking as well about the different impacts as well of these subsidies on the beneficiaries. Slide 5, the situation of subsidies in target countries. There are different sorts of subsidies. Some countries subsidize bread and other basic products. Others subsidize energy. Others housing programs, affordable housing. Others support as well producers and also export their products. And there was as well in some countries some subsidize the services in terms of education and health, and sometimes free education and health. And this is what we've noticed in different countries. Slide 6, and the different beneficiaries. Many benefit from these subsidies. Some families and households with limited income benefit from these subsidies. Other consumers benefit as well from subsidies through, of course, the indirect who benefit from subsidies through the indirect subsidies given to producers. The producers sometimes as well benefit from these direct subsidies, and individuals in general, so members of the society benefit as well from these subsidies. In fact, whenever they have more purchasing power, they can afford to buy more products. And these are in brief the beneficiaries. Slide 7 or slide 8, please. Better, he's saying next. Yes, this is it. So the major part of subsidies goes to energy, to supporting the energy sector in the Arab countries. And the subsidies related to energy in Arab countries are equal to the quarter amount of the subsidies of the energy sector in 2015 in the world. The majority of budgets of the Arab countries include these subsidies on food items and food products. Many Arab countries have adopted these policies of subsidizing products ever since the 1990s. Of course, some countries have suffered from budget deficits because of these subsidies. Other countries have tried as well to initiate some reforms for different reasons, mainly internal pressure, external pressure from the IMF, for example, and from other foreign entities or external entities. So there were many calls to initiate the structural reforms in different countries, economic and financial reforms, and this is why some countries initiated these reforms. Next slide, better, please. Regarding the impressions related to the subsidies currently in the region, we have noticed that these subsidies in the majority of Arab states is quite limited or marginal, if you could say so. There are different countries such as Bahrain, Jordan, and many other countries that have decided to limit the subsidies, and it appears that the subsidies in the health sector and the medications sector to be the most widespread, if you could say so, and this has the most impact on the Arab societies, and we still so there are different impact on of subsidies on different countries. Next slide, please. So. The subsidies policies in the Arab region aim at supporting people, vulnerable populations, mainly households with limited income as well. In terms of reforms related to the subsidies systems in the Arab region, many procedures were taken, mainly imposing indirect taxes, liberating as well the prices of certain products or certain energy products. There were as well many funding institutions and many foreign institutions that had asked countries to initiate these reforms in order to pursue their support. Next slide, please. The impact of subsidies and the different aftermath, if we could say so. If we have the traditional way of subsidizing products, if we adopt traditional policies, we will have a financial impact and an economic impact. In fact, these subsidies have burdened the budgets of many Arab countries. And regarding the economic impact on the short term, some key populations might benefit from subsidies, especially when they feel that they are living in better well-being, if you could say so. But this well-being is not sustainable, and on the long run, this budget, this burdening on the budget has led to even more vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. There were many other economic impacts as well. In fact, more there were other fiscal policies that were adopted, more taxes that were imposed, and this has limited as well people's income, and this had a repercussion on households. There were social impacts as well, because we could see many classes that started suffering from these subsidies policies. Some people benefited, some key populations benefited from these subsidies, others did not benefit from these subsidies, and this led to new values in societies, if you could say so, overspending in certain cases, the misuse of the subsidized products, the exploitation of subsidized products. Next slide, please, Behter. In light of the reforms and of the limited subsidies, we will have another financial impact. In fact, there would be an improvement, a slight improvement, and we've noticed a slight improvement in the budgets of countries. We have noticed as well less deficit. We have noticed as well that there are many structural problems in terms of the economic repercussions. We have noticed higher levels of unemployment, of poverty, vulnerability in the Arab regions, and this has led eventually to so less subsidies, more prices, so higher prices, limited affordability of these prices. So we have noticed that there were as well less subsidies on power, so on energy products, and this has led to more consumption in certain cases, and to less the people couldn't afford these services. Next slide, please, Behter. Regarding the social impact, in fact, after that, we had a limited. You still have 1 minute, sir. I'm sorry to interrupt you. In fact, we've noticed that we have more vulnerabilities, more poverties, more vulnerable populations, and there were no structural reforms. And if these policies aimed at reducing subsidies without finding alternative policies and alternative plans, will lead to more vulnerabilities. We won't have any middle class anymore. We will have the poor populations that are getting poorer. Next slide, Behter, please. So prospects. There is an agreement between different experts that it is necessary to implement the reforms, because the reforms implemented weren't enough, and this had a negative impact on the economic and the social aspects. In fact, the subsidies were decreased without any alternative plans. This is how we have seen more and more vulnerable people, less reforms, less subsidies, more vulnerabilities, poorer people. This has affected education, health, and more vulnerable fabric, social fabric. Last slide, please. So, yes, this one, please. So what is the best strategy? I think that there should be a gradual reduction in subsidies. There should be some exceptions. We should take into account the economic and social situation in the target countries. We should take more attention, or pay more attention, to the vulnerable populations. We should support these vulnerable populations. We should be able to secure some free services as well to these populations. Next, please. Regarding the measures taken, there should be we should know how to improve the situation. We should have clear indicators. If we truly want to know the impact of these policies on people, we should as well involve more institutions, civil society institutions, in these strategies and reforms. Thank you. Thank you. We will give the floor now to the next speaker. Before opening the floor for questions, we will give the floor to Mrs. Zeina Abla, who is a researcher. She has a 20-year experience in the field of development research in the Arab world, namely Lebanon. She has many researches in terms of political economy, world so agendas, global agendas. She was an expert to many UN agencies, many international organizations as well. So we will give you the floor directly, Mrs. Zeina. You will be talking about mainly deaths in Arab countries and the nature of the debt and debt structure in our region. What are the most important economic and social repercussions of the increasing deficit and the budget? Can we solve this problem in the Arab region? What's the alternative? Do you have another view? So we're talking about the debt crisis in the region. Thank you. First, I would like to thank the organizers and the participants. I will be talking about the crisis and the debt crisis in the region. We will be talking first about the global trend, then we will be talking about the Arab region, what we can do as a civil society in light of the different crises we're witnessing. In fact, we are going through hard times. We're suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic, but from the economic situation as well. Regarding the global trend, we have rising public debts around the world. Since 2008, the global debt to GDP rose more than 30%. In developing countries, we have the same trend that stocks had increased since 2008. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have noticed this increasing trend even in the developed countries, not only in developing countries. So what's happening is that we have more debt. So the share of private creditors has increased. In fact, the share of private creditors has increased. So from 8% to 20%, we notice the same trend in the developing countries. This leads, in fact, to a true problem, and we have, in certain cases, internal but external debts as well. Across the world, we are noticing as well another trend, increasing trend, which is related not only to the public debt but to the private debt as well, which is increasing in many fields and many sectors, whether in terms of financial institutions or households as well. So we have more public debts, but more private debts as well among households and financial institutions and non-financial institutions. This is quite worrying as well because eventually this will be part of the public debt. So private debt with time can become part of the public debt. Across the world, we are noticing as well an increasing or a rising external debt. 70% of long-term debt is in dollars, in US dollars. It was 50% only in 2007, so it's 70% now. 70% of long-term debts in dollars. Now we've noticed low interest rates in producing countries, so in northern countries after 2008. And since developing countries need these fundings, so they're benefiting from these fundings. This has been ongoing ever since 2008, but this trend might change, and there are no, unfortunately, any parties that can run or manage this financial capital in the region. and namely in our Arab countries, countries with limited income. We have more than 90% of debts, so debt to GDP pre-COVID in countries, Arab countries, mainly in mid-income and less developed countries. In some countries, there are concession loans and some debt reliefs. In middle-income countries, we have a 48% debt to GDP in 2018 compared to 26% in 2008. The majority of this debt is internal, but we have an external debt as well, and we are seeing more and more debts from private sector, private creditors. So 44% of external debt in the MENA region is from the private sector. This complicates even more the restructuring, and this leads to quick exiting of funds. I would like to stress on the fact that there are in certain cases some debts that are not accounted for, which is the hidden debt, if we could say so. And since we have more of a public-private partnership, we're seeing more and more hidden debt. This debt is paid by the state whenever there are partnerships with the private sector. In fact, the state assumes the responsibility of these risks, and if these risks occur, the state has to pay for the private sector, and this is a burden as well.
In the past few years, this situation became clear after a deficit since 2019. What can we deduct from this crisis? A case where debt and foreign currency held by nationals. This shows that the ability to use fiscal and monetary policy was limited because of fixation on a fixed exchange rate system, will ultimately triggered crises. This shows as well the link between the central bank and the private sector, the banking sector, and our inability today to solve this crisis without taking into consideration the banker debt. If we take, for instance, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, who are in continuous engagement with the IMF, after a period of state interventionist policies in 70s, along with the historical twin deficits. Abla, you only have 2 minutes now. These countries are now in a period of aggregate demand and also are facing social problems. After the COVID-19 pandemic, all of their other indicators are on the rise. As for Iraq, this is a special case because of the pre-2003 debt and also some policies that were adopted after 2003. Iraq was not able to ensure the sustainability of its debt, and after the COVID-19 pandemic, Iraq is also trying to reduce its expenditures. In all of these cases, the public debt is outgrowing social and expenditure, as we can see in these figures. Especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, some countries such as Jordan, Egypt, and Tunisia are going back to the IMF for funding. The IMF is also requiring austerity from these countries, while the majority of the region's populations are suffering from poverty. Even with the current situation, the IMF believes there are risks for that sustainability. I believe this international crisis, this global crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic constitutes an opportunity. It showed states the need for social expenditure, for social investment. We have to seize this opportunity to rethink our public debt to ensure its sustainability, and also to make sure that the debt will not push us from the development path that we should follow, especially with Agenda 2030. Thank you. I try to be as brief as possible. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Let's move now to this third presentation, Dr. Mohammed Loutfy. Actually, I think Dr. Nabil Abdo is our next speaker. I will introduce him briefly. He's a lecturer in the Lebanese American University in Beirut. He's a specialist in the political, economic, and social policies. He conducted research and studies on migration, informal economy, taxation, and equality. In addition to social justice, he has great experience in research and worked for a number of financial institutions such as Arab Network and others. Nabil will talk to us today about the social spending and austerity in Arab states. He will show us how these austerity policies lasted for decades in the region, and how was that related to social spending, especially after COVID-19 pandemic, and how things have changed after the pandemic, to better or worse. Thank you, Salma. Before I begin my intervention, I just want to clarify that I do not teach at the Lebanese American University, LAU. Currently, I work for Oxfam. You can see my screen, right? I shared my screen. When it comes to austerity in the region, before I start my presentation, allow me to say that this region entered the era of the pandemic with a very threatening indicators. You are aware that this region actually is one of the most regions with the greatest inequality. The richest 1% of the population receive 30% of the income, and in the period between 2010 and 2019, 2020, the wealth and the number of wealthy individuals in the region increased in Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Morocco, according to the data that we managed to gather at Oxfam. During this decade, it's the decade of austerity after the Arab Spring, following the Arab Spring. Austerity policies that my colleagues mentioned, that Zeina and Dr. Naser mentioned earlier, exacerbated the crisis to a large extent. In this region, the pandemic began with a lack of policies and tools for social to make sure that society will manage to overcome this crisis, such as unemployment benefits and social security. So we are surviving this pandemic without having the tools to overcome the obstacles of this pandemic. This is due, and to a large extent, to the austerity policies that I addressed and mentioned. When you talk about austerity, I have to clarify a point. When we talk about austerity, we're talking about a policy based on reducing public expenditure, government expenditure, and making sure that revenues rise. Austerity is comprised of policies that aim at ensuring fiscal consolidation to allow governments and states to be able to pay public debt, because austerity actually follows the threat of not paying public debts. So it is important to look at the situation from this perspective, from this angle. The danger of austerity is the fact that regular people, regular citizens, and the most vulnerable and the poorer and the middle class end up paying the repercussions and suffering the repercussions of austerity. These austerity policies are used usually and implemented in order to pay public debts. So we have this austerity model in the region in the past 10 years, let's say, and even since the 80s, but especially in the last decade and the last 10 years at the request or after the Arab Spring. For instance, in Egypt, between 2014 and 2018, the tax revenues of companies were reduced by 33%. However, household taxation rose by 12%. The same applies for Tunisia. In the last 10 years, corporate taxation was reduced by 37%, and household taxation rose by 10%. And also, like Dr. Naser mentioned, reducing subsidies. The IMF, when the IMF supported some countries in the region, started saying that subsidies are inefficient. And the IMF said that perhaps we can reduce subsidies. Can you hear me? So they would reduce subsidies, and the money that is saved from reducing subsidies could be used and invested in social programs to benefit the most vulnerable and the poor segment of society. But what we saw, for instance, in the case of Jordan, reducing subsidies in 2012 was about 12%. However, today it's 10%. And spending on social protection was reduced as well. It did not increase as was promised by IMF. It was reduced. So reducing subsidies did not lead to increasing spending on the social benefits or social program. The most dangerous aspect of these austerity policies is the fact that these policies were translated into other programs. Let's give you an example. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It showed a reduced redistribution. It showed that this redistribution touched the most vulnerable and not the richer segments of society. If we look at the impact of COVID-19, the loss of income in the region as a result of COVID-19 reached $85 billion. However, the wealth of the billionaires rose by $63 million daily during the pandemic, at least $10 billion in general. In Egypt, for instance, a tax was imposed on workers to finance the response to COVID-19 instead of taxing the wealthier segments of society. So Egypt actually taxed workers to finance its response to COVID-19. In Jordan, the state used half of the contributions and taxations to support maternity in 2020 and also to support the weak segments of society. The government, so it financed its response to the COVID-19 from taxing the poor. At the same time, they reduced contributions to social security, which was actually at the request of the IMF, i.e. reducing the contributions to the social security fund. This was actually portrayed to the public as a complex operation or a complicated idea. However, it's not that complicated. In Morocco, they imposed a solidarity tax up to 1.5% on the wages that reach 28,000 dirhams or more, which is the middle class, for one time in order to finance their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have seen that the most vulnerable and the poorer segments of society were not protected in Egypt, even if funds were allocated to informal workers. However, statistics in Egypt show that 5.4% only of these financial transactions actually benefited informal workers. So this is one of the policies that failed. I won't take long. I just want to say that austerity is not inevitable. Austerity is usually portrayed as an inevitable option. However, we always have additional options. We can always increase revenues and reduce expenditure. We can also increase revenues by increasing tax on the wealthier segments of society. In Jordan, if the state imposed a tax on wealth up to 2% since 2010, the state would have managed to gather $2.65 billion, i.e. 1.34 times the amount of all IMF loans between 2012 and 2019 in Morocco. If a similar tax of 2% was forced on net wealth, it would have gathered $6.17 billion between 2010 and 2019. We could have imposed a gradual tax in the past 10 years, or even now, we could have avoided a lot of these austerity policies. The same goes for expenditure. Now, as Zeina mentioned earlier, the IMF, even in the loans the fund is giving during the COVID-19 pandemic, is actually stipulating that states should return to austerity policies as of 2021 and reduce the wages of public servants and also reduce contributions to pensions and other benefits of which citizens benefit from, which will inevitably impact the lives of the majority of citizens and lead to a lower standard of living. Solutions exist, and we could utilize and implement a gradual taxation in order to fund social programs. And as Zeina mentioned earlier, regional states should adopt tools and mechanisms to suspend the repayment of debt, because we might be at the verge of a debt crisis. Thank you, Nabil. Thank you for this rich and interesting presentation. Finally, for the final presentation, Dr. Mohammed Ali Loutfy. He is the Executive Director of the Regional Union for People with Disabilities. Please continue. Dr. Mohammed Ali Loutfy is the head consultant for advocacy and capacity building for the International Initiative for ICT and Inclusive Information. Dr. Loutfy contributed to a number of research and studies on the rights of people with special needs when it comes to inclusive education, social protection policies, and participation in political life. Dr. Mohammed Loutfy will tackle the issue of inclusive development in the region, and will also give us some recommendations to guarantee inclusiveness. Thank you, Mrs. Salma. I would like to thank my fellow colleagues for their interventions during this session and for the topics and subjects they managed to raise concerning the macro policies and approaches at the policy level. These policies that would reflect in the reality of the most marginalized in the Arab region. What I will discuss today will actually explain the results of the financial crisis of which the region is suffering when it comes to focusing on repaying the public debt, or also Arab government's approval and implementation of IMF policies and the austerity policies that are forced and implemented. Perhaps we had to adopt these policies, unfortunately, and we lost many opportunities as a result of lack of planning or inefficient planning that Arab governments and states should have done as of their establishment. I would like to explain first the nature of the expenditure happening now in the public budgets of Arab states in terms of ensuring the rights and achieving the development goals. I apologize, I did not prepare a PowerPoint presentation. I prefer to address the topic without a PowerPoint presentation. I hope this will allow you to focus more. I will address a number of points. First, when it comes to a public policy on social issues, Arab states still adopt in their policies a quantitative instead of a qualitative perspective, i.e., if we are to talk about social policies in Arab states are still using rentier economy. So Arab states look into social issues as a charity work, not from an inclusive development perspective. The greatest example of that is the continuous support of Arab states to charities that are not inclusive or do not lead to the inclusion of people with disabilities. Government and public budgets are actually paying extensively for the activities of these associations. Today, when caregiving institutions produce people with disabilities who are unable to be integrated in the labor force and the labor market, this means that we lost 20% of the population who are not active in the labor market. This means that we lost a percentage of the national income and expenditure at the social level, 20% of the expenditure. This is if we actually measure the disabilities or physical disabilities. Regardless if we adopt policies that take into consideration emergencies and labor and work hazards that impact employees or workers and force them to lose their professional activity and weakens their capacity to be productive and to consume, leading eventually to their contribution to the development path and increasing the national income to the maximum. What I'm trying to say is that the Arab states' continuous support of these policies hinders hinders these states' attempt for sustainable developments. However, we can mention a number of achievements or a progress that was made at the level of Arab states' handling of social issues. This might be true to some extent, especially when we look into UN organized conferences or IMF or World Bank reports, and what Arab states actually mention in their reports. However, we have to ask the question, is this progress real? Is it translated into reality? Unfortunately, governments' handling of inclusion and universal development is limited to checking the point, just to checkpoints, but not to achieve any achievement or progress or transformation when it comes to the development path at the social and economic levels. Certainly, this is due to a lack of effective political decision to make sure that political and economic policies are wide-ranging and futuristic, taking into consideration the capacities and capabilities of every citizen to make sure that all citizens participate in the social and economic productive policies. This shows a lack of criteria that contribute to public policies ensuring the feasibility of productive sectors. We can see that public budgets, when it comes to disabilities, there is a very small percentage, less than 1% of the budget that assists people with disabilities and supports some institutions that care for people with disabilities. The quantitative services provided are of a lesser value and benefit no one. Unless some influential people utilize or exploit these services to make sure that their supporters will vote for them during the elections. As I mentioned earlier, this expenditure goes to institutions that constitute a burden to productivity and public budget expenditure, but do not provide the revenue for the beneficiaries and do not support people with disabilities to be contributors to the productive process. What is needed? What is required? What is required is to ensure that public budgets take into consideration an inclusive universal development plan. It is not sufficient to say, as some officials might say, that they are supporting people with disabilities. This is not enough. It is not enough to support a given institution or a given program. They do that just to appease donors and to show a position that is not in reality their true stance. So their support does not lead to enabling and empowering these vulnerable and marginalized categories to take part in the productivity. As Mr. Nabil mentioned regarding taxation, In the Arab world, there is no taxation justice. We talk about taxation justice when it comes to paying taxation, but not when it comes to the expenditure mechanism. As Mr. Nabil mentioned, we talk about redistributing expenditure between the middle class and the poor segments of society. While the wealthy segments of society do not have to pay taxes. So we redistribute poverty. We have and we need policies that promotes taxation justice based on representing different segments of society, and also to lead the most marginalized to take part in the productive economy. Finally, we still have 2 minutes. Governments should adopt transparent policies in drafting public budgets and economic policies. First, by guaranteeing access of marginalized segments to information regarding the public budget. Civil society organizations and the representatives of marginalized categories should have the right to take part in planning for the economic and social levels. We cannot say that we are participating in the sustainable development process in our Arab states if we exclude the presence, position, and voice of the marginalized in the decision-making process, even when it comes to drafting public policies. I come to the end of my intervention.